Look at you, still playing nurse, even now that there's nobody left to nurse.
There's always somebody.
You always did like being needed more than you being anything else.
Maybe so.
Must be nice, having nothing left to prove.
You'd be surprised what's still left to prove.
That exchange happened on the back porch 40 minutes before anyone touched the will. She had no idea that 11 days earlier, the man she had just called pathetic had signed a licensing deal worth $2 million. The paperwork listed one figure more precisely than that $2,340,000, and his was the only name on it. Nobody in that kitchen knew it, not the cousins, not the neighbors, carrying foil pans up the back steps, not even her mother. There was one more thing. Nobody in that house knew that morning, and it had nothing to do with money at all. 10 months before the funeral, in a rocking chair on that same back porch, my father-in-law had asked me a question. He wanted to know what I planned to build once he was no longer around to need building for. I still did not have a good answer to that. And some part of me suspects I still don't. If you have ever spent years being useful to people who were embarrassed to be seen needing you, stay with me. This is that story. My name is Everett Marsh. I am 51 years old, and for most of my adult life, I believed being needed was the closest thing to being loved I was ever going to get. I do not believe that anymore. It took a divorce, a funeral, and a folder full of patent paperwork to unlearn it. It started in the way these things really start. On the day I sat across from my supervisor and asked to drop to 20 hours a week. I did not tell him why. He did not ask. I signed the request with the same pen I used to sign report cards for a son I never had. I never had children of my own. But I had a father-in-law who could no longer stand up out of a chair without help. By then I had quietly started thinking of that as its own kind of family. The kind nobody puts on a holiday card. I had spent 11 years at that firm before I ever asked for those reduced hours. Most of that work was inspecting parking structures and highway overpasses for stress fractures nobody else could see coming. I was good at that work, the kind of good that gets you quiet respect rather than loud praise, which suited me fine at the time. I did not know yet that the same eye for hidden stress would end up saving a man's hip instead of a concrete overpass. Looking back, the two skills were never as different as they sounded. That house sat on Delmar Lane in Collier Heights, 2 streets back from Cascade Road. A magnolia out front dropped waxy leaves onto a porch. Somebody swept every morning out of habit more than necessity. 2 doors down, a retired postal carrier named Franklin still walked the same loop he'd walked professionally for 30 years. He just did it without the mailbag now. He waved at that porch every single morning, rain or shine, the same 2 fingers off the brim of his cap, whether or not anybody waved back. Cornelius used to say that man had delivered more comfort in 30 years of small waves than most preachers manage in a whole career of sermons. The kitchen smelled like coffee going cold in a dozen abandoned cups. It smelled like 3 different sweet potato pies, each one brought by a woman, certain hers was the only one anybody would want. A card table by the back door held a stack of thank you notes somebody had already started addressing. A box of stamps sat open beside it, half the flap torn away. Somebody had propped a framed photograph of Cornelius in his deacon robes against the toaster. It was the kind of small, unplanned shrine that appears in every kitchen after a funeral without anybody deciding to build it. Somewhere past the hallway, a radio still played low gospel, the kind Sunday dinners had always played in that house since before I married into it. I had driven straight from the cemetery to that house, still in the same dark suit. I was still carrying the particular stillness a graveside service leaves behind in a man's chest. The graph paper sketch of that transfer rail sat folded inside a metal box in my own garage. Across town, the same box where I kept the badge and the notebook. I had not looked at that sketch in over a year, not since the day the licensing company's engineer came out to measure the prototype himself. I had almost forgotten. It existed the way you forget the shape of a scar until somebody puts a finger right on it. Here is the part nobody in that kitchen knew, yet the part I had been carrying alone for 2 years. The device I built in that garage let a 210-pound man move himself from a bed to a wheelchair without either of us risking a fall. It started as scrap aluminum and a bent idea sketched on graph paper at midnight because I could not sleep and he could not safely stand. I welded the first frame myself on a Sunday in a garage that still smelled like his old Buick, even after the Buick was long gone. The patent filing on that device did not list a family asset. It listed one name and one name only. My father-in-law insisted on that himself in his own handwriting the year before his hands got too unsteady to hold a pen for long. Cornelius Vance used to say, "A man's worth isn't the noise he makes." He used to say, "It's the weight he holds up without anybody hearing it." Creak. He said that to me on that same porch once, a glass of sweet tea going warm in his hand, while the radio played low behind him. I did not understand what he meant by it for a long time. I am still working out the last piece of it. Cornelius's own father had come up from a small town in Alabama in the 1950s, one of thousands who rode that same rail line north. He built a hardware supply business from almost nothing, and for years it did well enough that nobody in the family thought much about money. Then the year my ex-wife turned 9, that business folded inside of 8 months. I only know the details because Cornelius told them to me himself years later on that same porch. He told me Sylvia used to sit at the kitchen table some nights, counting quarters into paper rolls so their daughter could keep taking piano lessons. Nobody ever told my ex-wife why the lessons stopped that spring. She just noticed the way children notice that a thing she loved had quietly gone away. 40 minutes before anybody touched the will, I was out back refilling the coffee urn. I heard my ex-wife's voice carry through the kitchen window, pitched just loud enough for the people standing near her. She told them I was still playing nurse, even now that there was nobody left to nurse. A cousin beside her raised his glass and did not drink from it. "There's always somebody," I said mostly to myself, because she was not close enough to hear it. She said it again louder this time, that it must be nice having nothing left to prove. "You'd be surprised what's still left to prove," I said quiet enough that only the coffee urn heard me say it. "I want you to notice something about the man saying this to you, because it matters for what comes later." My hands did not shake pouring that coffee. Not once. 22 years of marriage teaches you exactly which insults are going to cost you sleep and which ones are just weather passing through a room. That one was weather. If you have ever stood holding a job you were proud of and watched somebody decide out loud that it made you smaller, you already know that particular quiet. There is a tired that does not come from the body. It settles somewhere behind the sternum, and it does not leave when you sit down. I had carried that tired the whole drive over that morning, before the funeral, before any of it. It comes from doing years of careful, unglamorous, unpaid work and watching people walk past it like it was furniture. The 7-day pill organizer I refilled every Sunday night sat on the same shelf so long it left a faint pale ring in the varnish. It was a shape only I would ever notice or miss. My hands learned the particular give of a blood pressure cuff before they forgot the feel of a torque wrench. Some nights I could not have told you which one I trusted more. I ate more meals standing at that counter at 11 o'clock than I ever ate sitting down. Sit down meant admitting the day was finally over, and some nights I was not ready to admit that. I learned to carry a man twice my size down 2 stairs without either of us saying a word, timing my breath to as the way you'd time a lift on a job site. I learned which of his silences meant pain and which ones meant he simply did not want to be watched, needing help. Those 2 silences did not sound the same at all once you knew to listen for it. I learned to change a shirt on a man who still had his pride, without either of us mentioning that his pride was the thing actually being handled that morning. I kept a small spiral notebook on the counter for 2 years, 1 line per day, blood pressure and pulse and whether he'd finished his plate. I still have that notebook. I have not opened it since the funeral, but I know exactly which kitchen drawer it sits in, same as the badge. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being underestimated. For so many years it starts to feel like weather you just learned to dress for. None of that made it into any conversation in that kitchen. Not that morning, not in 7 years. I had stopped expecting it to. 14 months before the funeral, My firm offered me a position running the whole structural inspection division. A corner office came with it, and a title with my name printed under it in the lobby directory. I turned it down on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room with a view of a parking deck. I still remember the exact sentence my manager used. Once he understood, I meant it. He said some men just don't want more, and he said it kindly, the way you'd say it about a dog that had stopped wanting to run. I still have the badge from that job in a drawer at my sister's house. It is the little laminated kind, my photo gone slightly yellow at the edges now. I do not look at it often. I know exactly which drawer it is in, though, and some part of me needs to know that. That same week, my ex-wife asked me over dinner whether I had thought about what came after once her father no longer needed a driver or steady hands. I told her I had not let myself think that far ahead. She set her fork down without finishing the plate, and she did not bring the subject up again for a long time. That is the actual shape of what a sacrifice costs. Not a speech about it. Just a badge in a drawer, a fork set down early, and a title that went to somebody else that same year. I picked up every overnight shift that mattered for 7 years. I adjusted my whole life around a medication schedule that changed 4 separate times. I never once heard anybody in that family say the words "thank you" out loud, not because they were cruel, because it never once occurred to them there was anything to thank me for. That is not a wound. I am asking you to bleed for me over. It is just a fact laid out flat, the way you would read a gauge. My own grandmother. Miss Odessa raised me most of the years. My mother worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. She had her own sayings about what a man owed a room. Every June, our whole extended family still gathers for a reunion out past Stone Mountain. Folding tables stretch end to end under the same pecan trees my great-uncle planted decades ago. I missed 2 of those reunions during the years I was caring for Cornelius. It was the first time I had ever missed one since I was a boy, in a matching family t-shirt 2 sizes too big. Nobody scolded me for missing them. Nobody mentioned it at all, which somehow said more than scolding would have. She used to tell me a boy who makes himself useful enough, long enough, eventually earns his place at the table. I did not think much of that saying as a boy. I have thought about it almost every day since I was 50 years old. And standing in a kitchen holding a coffee urn, nobody had asked me to refill. By the morning of the funeral, the silence had started to feel like a room I lived in, rather than a thing that just happened to me. The service that morning ran long. The way homegoings for a deacon of 30 years tend to run long. 3 separate choirs sang, and 2 men could not finish their tributes standing up. The pastor spoke for a long while about a life well spent in service to others. At one point he used my father-in-law's own words, a line Cornelius had apparently said from the pulpit years earlier about carrying weight quietly. I felt several heads turn slightly in my direction when the pastor said it. I sat in the second pew, not the first, because the divorce had made seating into its own quiet negotiation nobody wanted to have out loud. My sister Naomi sat beside me anyway. Her hand light on my back, the whole service the way she had done at every hard thing since we were children. Her son, Micah 16, and still too polite to know. He was allowed to look bored at something like this, kept glancing over at me. He looked like he was checking a gauge of his own. The kitchen went quiet for a moment after the exchange by the coffee urn. It was the kind of quiet that happens right before somebody arrives, that a room was not quite ready for. I heard the front screen door open that particular creak it had always had. It stayed open a beat longer than an ordinary visitor would leave it. Every conversation on that back porch slowed down just enough for me to notice that somebody had walked in, though I could not see the door from where I stood. I set the coffee urn down. I still remember the sound my own hand made against the metal louder than I meant it to be. By then, the house had filled the way. These houses always fill with people who loved my father-in-law in a dozen different sized ways. There were deacons from the church still in their good suits, women from the usher board, fanning themselves with the funeral program. 2 men who had worked construction alongside him in the 70s stood near the punch bowl telling a story I had heard 3 versions of. My ex-wife's fiancé stood near the dining room in a suit that fit a little too well for a homegoing talking to a cousin about a listing on Cascade Road. He had a way of touching people's forearms when he talked to them like he was closing something instead of just making conversation. I did not dislike him for that. Not exactly. I had simply watched enough men on enough job sites to know the difference between being good at a thing and being good at sounding good at it. I counted at least a dozen folding chairs, pulled in from the garage, every single one of them full. There was a woman near the buffet table I did not recognize, dressed plainly, checking her watch twice in the span of a minute. She was the only person in that kitchen who was not eating, and I noticed it the way you notice a wire that is live before you touch it. Somebody near the screen door said a name I recognized, a name that belonged to my father-in-law's lawyer. Every voice on that porch dropped by half. Sylvia's hand found the doorframe like she needed it to still be standing there. Even my ex-wife stopped mid-sentence, her mouth still open on a word she never finished. I had never met the woman walking through that door before. Though I had heard her name mentioned on phone calls I was not supposed to be listening to. She carried a slim leather portfolio against her chest like it weighed more than it looked. She did not smile at anyone in that kitchen, not even the people she clearly recognized. Her eye moved once around the room and landed on me standing by the coffee urn for exactly 1 second. Then she looked away first, which told me more than a longer look would have. Nobody in that kitchen understood yet why a dead man's lawyer would walk straight past the dining room table and toward the back porch. I understood a little more than nobody. I still did not understand how much of what she was carrying in that portfolio had my name written somewhere inside it. My grandmother used to say, "A locked door doesn't care how politely you knock, it only opens for the right key." I had been knocking politely at a great many doors for a great many years by that point in my life. I did not yet know that the woman crossing that kitchen was holding one of the keys and that it did not belong to the door I thought it did. Somebody pulled a chair back from the dining table. The scrape of it loud enough to make 3 separate conversations stop at once. Whatever was about to happen in that house, it was not going to happen quietly, and it was not going to happen without me standing in the middle of it. My sister stepped in from the porch before anybody asked her, to the way she has done at every hard thing since we were children. She did not say a word. She crossed the dining room, stood at my shoulder, and folded her arms in a way that told the whole room she intended to stay exactly where she was. My ex-wife saw her first, and something in her face changed before the lawyer had said a single sentence. My sister has spent 30 years on that usher board greeting half of Collier Heights by name. It is a church that does not forget a kindness, and it does not forget a slight either. Her presence in that room meant whatever happened next would not stay inside that house. I think I finally understand all these years later why the sight of my sister rattled my ex-wife more than the lawyer's arrival did. A woman who grew up watching her own mother count quarters into paper rolls does not fear cruelty from a room. She fears witnesses to it because a witness makes a thing permanent in a way silence never does. Her cruelty in that kitchen was never really about me or about the coffee urn or even about the will waiting to be read. It was about a 9-year-old who had once watched something she loved disappear without one word of explanation. She had spent every year since making sure she was never that unprepared again. I am not telling you this to excuse what she said by that coffee urn. I am telling you because it is true, and because a story that only lets you be angry at somebody is usually leaving something out. The lawyer introduced herself as Doris. She set her portfolio on the dining table and asked everyone still standing to find a seat. Nobody moved for a moment, the way a room holds still, right before the first line of a hymn. Then folding chairs scraped against hardwood floor one after another until every seat from the porch had found its way inside. Doris confirmed in plain language that Cornelius Vance had left a formal letter alongside his will. It was to be read aloud to the family gathered in that room. That much confirmed the thing I had already half suspected walking in from the porch. It did not confirm how much of that letter had my name inside it. It did not tell me how many pages I still had left to hear. My own father died when I was 26. The only thing of his I ever kept was a steel tool chest, the kind with a dozen small drawers, each one worn smooth on the pull. 3 years into caring for Cornelius, a specialist visit came back with a copay gap insurance would not cover. 4 figures due inside of 2 weeks. I sold that tool chest to a man 2 counties over who restocks estate sales. I did not tell a single person in that family I had done it. I still remember standing in my own driveway, watching a stranger loaded into a pickup truck. The drawers rattled every time the truck hit a pothole leaving my street. That is the kind of math nobody sees. A father's memory gets weighed against a father-in-law's specialist bill, and you make the trade in about 4 seconds. There was never really a decision to make. I am a caregiver. Not a hobby, not a phase, not something I fell into by accident. A caregiver the same way. Another man is an electrician, or a pastor, or a mechanic a thing. I built skill it on purpose over years, the hard way. Cornelius was not an easy man to care for. And I want to say that plainly too, because pretending otherwise would insult the actual work of it. He hated being helped into that shower chair more than he hated almost anything else in his final years. He told me so some mornings in language I will not repeat here. I had been a deacon for 30 years, a man who carried collection plates and shook 100 hands every Sunday. His body, forgetting how to stand up on its own, felt to him like a personal betrayal. I learned slowly that the way to help a proud man was to let him direct as much of it as he possibly could. That was true even when directing it took 3 times as long as just doing it myself. Some mornings that meant standing patiently in a bathroom doorway for 10 extra minutes while he insisted on buttoning his own shirt. I never once rushed him, not even on the mornings I was already running late for something else entirely. I learned to read a face for pain the way I once read a stress fracture in a steel beam by the smallest possible tell. I learned the particular sound a walker makes on hardwood when a man is tired, but too proud to say so. I learned to sit up some nights until 3 in the morning, listening for a specific kind of coughing. One kind meant call the doctor. A different kind just meant let him sleep. The graph paper sketch came out of one of those 3 in the morning nights, drawn on the back of a grocery receipt, because it was the only paper within reach. Doris began reading the letter in a steady, unhurried voice, the voice of somebody who has read a great many wills to a great many rooms. She was maybe 60 silver, threaded through close-cropped hair reading glasses on a beaded chain she did not bother to put on. She held the pages instead at arm's length. I learned later she had been the Vance family's attorney for over 20 years. She had drafted 3 different wills for Cornelius as his circumstances changed over time. She had buried her own husband that same spring, not long after Cornelius buried his wife's mother. None of that history was visible in her voice that afternoon. It stayed level and unhurried through every page, the way a good nurse keeps her voice level while she's telling you something you do not want to hear. The first 2 pages were what everyone expected. A modest inheritance divided evenly, a note about the house instructions, about the burial plot beside his own father's. I noticed things while she read that I do not think anyone else in that room noticed. The 7-day pill organizer was still sitting on a shelf in that kitchen 3 rooms away, because nobody had thought yet to put it somewhere else. A pair of his old reading glasses still sat folded on the side table by his recliner. They were exactly where he'd left them the last morning he was strong enough to sit up in it. Somebody had already moved the recliner itself an inch closer to the window. It is the way families rearrange a room without meaning to, just to make the absent sit differently. The graph paper sketch of the transfer rail existed in 2 places now. One was folded in my garage across town, and one was reproduced clean and official inside the folder in front of Doris. Somewhere in the 3rd page. Doris paused and looked up briefly. She said Cornelius had asked her to read one particular passage exactly as he had dictated it, word for word. That passage named a scholarship fund at the church and that covered application fees for graduating seniors who could not otherwise afford them. Cornelius wrote that the fund had run dry 3 years earlier. It had been quietly refilled since then by someone in that very room, someone who never once asked for it to be mentioned. He had asked Doris to mention it anyway, because a debt owed in silence is still a debt, and he did not want to die owing one. I knew exactly which application fees he meant. I had written that check myself 3 years back, standing at the same kitchen counter where the pill organizer now sat. A girl from the youth choir, a senior, that spring had come up $200 short on her enrollment fee. Her mother had mentioned it once quietly to nobody in particular after service. I had mailed a check the following Monday with no name on the memo line, and I had never once brought it up again, not even to Cornelius. He had found out anyway, the way people who pay close attention to a family always eventually find out everything. He made me promise to say the name out loud, Doris said, and she looked directly at me when she said it. I felt heat move up the back of my neck before I understood why. I was not proud in that moment, not the way you might expect. I was something closer to embarrassed, the particular embarrassment of watching a private thing pulled into daylight before you were ready. A good deed announced out loud tops. Belonging to the person who did it, and starts belonging to the room, and I had never wanted it to belong to a room. Two of my ex-wife's cousins, the same two who had laughed loudest by the coffee urn that morning, would not meet my eyes for the rest of that reading. I did not feel triumphant watching them look away. I felt something closer to tired, the same tired I had carried in the car that morning, just wearing a different coat. My ex-wife had not said a word through any of it. I noticed her studying the side of Doris's face the way you study a weather report you are hoping will change if you look at it long enough. Doris turned another page, and her voice changed slightly. The way a voice changes when it is about to deliver something the reader did not expect either. She said Cornelius had grown concerned in his final year about certain conversations he'd been having with a man not yet married into the family. My ex-wife's fiancé shifted in his seat. Doris did not look at him yet. She said Cornelius had documented in his own hand 3 separate occasions when that man encouraged him to move funds out of a small family trust. He called it an opportunity, a mixed-use development slated for a corner lot on Cascade Road, 4 blocks from the church. Cornelius had written down the exact figure the man asked him to move, $51,000, along with the date of each conversation. The room's attention swung toward him so fast, I felt the air of it change. That trust wasn't his to touch, Doris said, and Cornelius knew it, which is exactly why he wrote it down. Nobody in that room had predicted this particular turn, and I include myself in that. I had expected an uncomfortable conversation about money changing hands toward me. I had not expected the letter to open a door on somebody else's conduct. Instead, a door nobody standing in that dining room had seen coming. My ex-wife's fiancé opened his mouth to explain himself, and for the first time all day, no words came out of it easily. Sylvia had not said one word since Doris began reading. She sat at the head of the table, in the same chair she had sat in for every Sunday dinner I had ever attended in that house. Her spine stayed straight the way it always was in church. I watched her hands folded on the tablecloth go still, in a way that was different from the stillness she'd carried all morning. It was the stillness of a woman recalculating something she thought she already knew the shape of. She had welcomed that man to her table for the better part of a year. She had let him carve the Sunday roast twice and told a neighbor last month how steady he seemed for a young man in real estate. I do not think steady was the word she was reaching for anymore. Doris set the letter down flat on the table and squared its edges with 2 fingers. She looked up at the room like she had one more page left before anybody could speak. My ex-wife's fiancé found his voice before anyone else did, and it came out faster than he probably wanted it to. He said something about context, about how those conversations had been misunderstood, about how he had only ever wanted to help. Nobody in that room answered him right away. And the silence that followed did more damage than an argument would have. My sister's arms stayed folded through the whole exchange. Her face stayed unreadable in the particular way she perfected somewhere around her 40th year of ushering. Micah had drifted in from the porch at some point and now stood in the hallway doorway. He watched the grown folks with the frank, unguarded attention only a 16-year-old can afford in a room like that. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that silence, because it was not triumph. It was something closer to shame, and I have turned that feeling over enough times since to understand why. I had spent 7 years being quietly useful in a house that barely noticed. And here was a man being loudly ambitious in the same house within 18 months. Watching him unravel did not feel like winning. It felt like watching a mirror. Somebody had angled wrong, showing me a version of effort I had never once tried and did not particularly want. My ex-wife sat very still through all of it. her hands folded in her lap, the way her mother's were. I have known her long enough to recognize the specific stillness that means she is doing arithmetic nobody else can see. I do not think she had known about the trust conversations. I think watching her face that this particular piece of the afternoon was landing on her exactly as hard as it had landed on the rest of us. That is the part of this story I did not expect to feel, and I am not going to pretend I saw it coming. Doris turned to the final page and explained in the plain, careful language lawyers use what the letter's central instruction actually was. She confirmed that Cornelius had 3 years earlier co-signed the initial fabrication costs for a device built in a garage on the other side of town. She confirmed that the resulting patent had recently been licensed to a healthcare company and that the licensing figure was substantial. She did not read the number out loud. She said the number was recorded separately in a document already filed with the estate and that it belonged to exactly one person in that room. I did not say a word. I did not have to. Every eye in that dining room found me at the same moment. It was the way a room's attention moves when it finally understands which direction a story has been pointing the whole time. My ex-wife's mouth opened slightly. The same unfinished motion I had seen on her face by the coffee urn 40 minutes earlier. This time nothing came out of it at all. My sister's hand pressed once against my shoulder, light and brief. It was the same signal she used to give me across a church pew when we were children, whenever I was about to lose my composure over something small. I did not lose my composure. I had spent 7 years learning how not to, in rooms far harder than this one. Somewhere near the kitchen, a phone began to ring, an unfamiliar tone that did not belong to anybody's phone I recognized from that family. Doris reached into her portfolio and pulled out a second phone, a plain black one I had not noticed her carrying. She looked at the screen, then looked at me. "This is the call I told them to expect around now," she said quietly, holding the phone up just slightly, not yet offering it to anyone. Nobody in that room had any idea who was on the other end of that call, myself included, though I had a guess forming that made my chest go tight. The name on the screen, she told me later, belonged to a regional director at the company that had licensed the patent. He had asked whether the family had been informed yet. He had asked whether it would be appropriate to confirm the closing figures aloud while everyone was already gathered. Doris had told him it would be exactly the right time. Whatever came next was not going to happen in the kitchen, and it was not going to happen quietly either. Doris answered the call standing right there at the dining table and put it on speaker without being asked to. A man's voice, calm and businesslike, confirmed the licensing figure out loud. Then he asked a routine question about wire transfer details that meant nothing to anyone in that room except me. I watched my ex-wife's face while the number hung in the air. I counted without meaning to, the way you count things when you need somewhere else to put your attention. 11 people stood or sat in that dining room besides Doris and myself, not counting Micah, still out on the porch steps. Deacons, ushers, 2 cousins, a neighbor who had wandered over from next door out of pure curiosity. Nobody blamed her for. Every one of them had heard some version of the story that painted me as a man who had settled for less than he was capable of. Something moved behind her eyes that was not envy and was not anger. It looked more than anything like a woman doing quick arithmetic on every conversation she had ever had with me and not liking most of the new totals. She had built a version of our marriage where my choices made me small. That version did not survive contact with a number that large. I think some part of her understood right then that it had never really been about the number at all. It had been about a girl who once watched piano lessons disappear without explanation. That girl grew into a woman who promised herself she would never again be the last one to understand her own life. The number in that moment was not a prize. It was proof she had misread the man across the table from her for the better part of 2 decades. There is no comfortable way to sit with a mistake that size in front of your whole family. Sylvia rose from her chair first before anyone else moved. Her chair scraped back hard enough that 2 people near her flinched. She crossed the room to where her daughter's fiancé was still standing near the window. Her steps were unhurried, deliberate, the walk of a woman who had led 100 church processions. She knew exactly how to make a room watch her without raising her voice. That deal you pushed him into signing has my name on the same page as his, and I did not put it there," she said. Her voice stayed even church quiet, the kind that carries further than shouting. "I was only trying to help him, same as anybody in this room," he said. "You were trying to help yourself to what was left of him," she said. "There's a difference, and everybody standing here just watched you forget it." "Lord!" Somebody whispered near the hallway, and nobody laughed this time. Two cousins who had laughed loudest by the coffee urn that morning would not lift their eyes off the tablecloth. He opened his mouth once more, found nothing worth saying, and closed it again. His hand, I noticed, had drifted to his own jacket pocket and gone still there. It was the way a man's hand goes still when it realizes there is nothing left in that pocket worth reaching for. I did not stay to watch the rest of that particular reckoning. It was not mine to watch, and some part of me still respected him too much as a fellow human being to enjoy it from the front row. I stepped back into the kitchen instead, meaning only to set the coffee urn in the sink and give the dining room a minute to itself. The linoleum in that kitchen still had a worn patch by the stove. It had been there since the first Thanksgiving I ever spent in that house 23 years earlier. My ex-wife was already there, one hand flat on the counter, not moving. "Still in that gray sweater. Still smelling like my father's medicine cabinet," she said. It kept me close to him," I said. "You made my sacrifice look so noble, it made the rest of us look small," she said, and her mother looked away from the doorway behind her. "That was never my aim," I said. "You never once asked if I wanted this life. You just built it and expected me to move in," she said. Her hand was not flat on the counter anymore. It was gripping the edge of it hard enough that her knuckles had gone pale. "You'll understand before this room empties out," I said. "You knew," she said. "I knew," I said quietly. Neither of us said anything for a long moment after that. The kitchen clock above the stove ticked loud enough to notice the way a clock only gets loud once a room has run out of other sounds. She let go of the counter edge, and I watched the color come back slowly into her knuckles. I had known for almost 2 years that she was already gone in every way that mattered. That was long before either of us said the word divorce out loud in a lawyer's office of our own. I had watched her stop asking how Cornelius's appointments went. I had watched her start arriving to Sunday dinner already dressed for somewhere else she needed to be after. None of that had ever once made me stop showing up at 6 in the morning to help her father into a shower chair. I am not telling you that to be praised for it. I am telling you because it is the plainest fact I know about myself. And I needed to say it once out loud, even if only to a kitchen counter. She did not cry, and I want to be honest, that I did not expect her to. She looked instead like a woman setting down a bag she had been carrying so long her arm had forgotten it was heavy. "I have to go back in there," she said, and this time her voice had no edge left in it at all. I did not answer her with a word. I nodded once the smallest motion and let her walk past me back toward the dining room. Her shoulder brushed mine as she passed the way. It had brushed mine 1,000 ordinary times over 22 years. Neither of us had ever thought to count them before that moment. I did not turn to watch her go. I heard the dining room absorb her back into itself. Chairs shifting, somebody murmuring her name low. I stood alone in that kitchen for a moment, next to a coffee urn that had gone cold an hour ago and a counter still warm where her hand had gripped it. The 7-day pill organizer was still sitting on the shelf above that counter, 3 days past its last refill. Nobody had thought yet to move it or empty it. I looked at it for longer than I meant to. The envelope Doris had left with me sat unopened on that same counter. My name was written across the front in handwriting. I recognized from every prescription label I had refilled for 7 years. I did not open it yet. My hands were steady picking it up, the same steady they had been pouring coffee that morning. I could not have told you why that mattered to me in the moment, but it did. I picked up my jacket from the back of a kitchen chair, and I walked out through the same screen door that had announced Doris an hour before. I did not say goodbye to anyone in that dining room. I did not need to. Naomi caught my eye through the window as I crossed the yard, and she gave me the smallest nod, the kind that means, "Go on. I've got this end of it." There was a version of this whole story where I might have lingered by that door a moment longer, waiting for someone to call me back inside. I did not wait. Micah was still sitting on the porch steps where I had left him that morning, though he stood when he saw my face. He did not ask me anything. He just fell into step beside me for the length of the front walk, the way a boy does when he does not yet have words for what he is offering. At the end of the walk, right before I reached the truck, he told me something I had not known. His great-uncle used to let him hold that graph paper sketch sometimes on quiet afternoons and never once told him not to touch it. It was a small thing, and it undid me a little more than the letter had. The rain had started sometime while we were all inside, the thin, cold kind that Atlanta gets in late autumn, more mist than storm. I got into my truck, set the envelope on the passenger seat, and sat there for a full minute before I turned the key. Through the windshield blurred by rain, I could still see shapes moving behind the dining room curtains, a family finishing something I had already left. I did not feel triumphant driving away from that house, and I want to be honest with you about that. Triumph is what this moment is supposed to feel like in every version of this story I had ever heard growing up. What I felt instead was closer to the particular quiet that comes after setting down something heavy. It is the quiet that comes once your arms have forgotten any other shape. It is not relief exactly. It is something more like ache that comes right after relief. Once the muscle finally understands, it is allowed to rest. The drive back to my sister's house took 20 minutes longer than it should have because I took the long way past Cascade Road without deciding to. The city did not know anything had happened that afternoon. Streetlights came on the same as always, and a man at a bus stop stood reading his phone under an umbrella like it was any other wet Tuesday in late autumn. My phone buzzed twice on the passenger seat beside the envelope, somewhere around the second red light. A text from my ex-wife, 3 sentences long, the word sorry appearing in the second one. I read it once, all the way through, standing at that red light with the wipers going. I turned the phone face down on the seat and did not pick it back up for the rest of the drive. Some conversations deserve more than a message typed in a parking lot, and I was not ready to decide which kind this one was going to be. At my sister's house, I went straight to the garage before I even took off my wet jacket. The metal box was exactly where it always was, on a shelf above the workbench. It sat between a coffee can of loose bolts and a stack of paint cans nobody had opened in years. I took out the graph paper sketch and unfolded it under the single bare bulb hanging over that bench. The pencil lines had gone soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded so many times over the years. It looked that night less like an engineering drawing and more like a letter I had written to myself a long time ago without knowing it. I had drawn it thinking only about weight distribution and pivot points. I understood, standing there with rain still on my collar, that I had also been drawing away to keep a man I loved from disappearing on my watch. That is not a thing you can put on a patent application, but it is the truer of the two purposes. Naomi found me out there 20 minutes later, 2 mugs of coffee in her hands, still in her funeral clothes, with her shoes already off. She did not ask what happened in that kitchen. She set one mug down on the workbench beside the sketch and pulled a stool over without a word. We sat out there a long while, the garage door half open to the rain, saying very little that would sound important written down. She asked once how I was doing, the plain way you ask a brother, not the careful way people ask a widower. I told her I did not fully know yet, and she nodded like that was a complete answer, because between us it was. At one point she reached over and turned the sketch a quarter turn on the bench, the way you'd square a picture frame that had gone crooked. Neither of us said anything about why she did it. Some gestures do not need translating between people who grew up in the same house. At some point, without either of us planning it, she started telling me about the year our mother worked 2 jobs and Miss Odessa raised us most days. She reminded me of a summer I had half forgotten when I was maybe 9. I had fixed the neighbor's bicycle chain for free rather than take the $2 he offered. Our mother had scolded me for it that night, not because I helped him. She scolded me because refusing the $2 made it look like accepting would have made the kindness smaller somehow. Naomi said she thought I had been practicing for this exact kind of week since I was 9 years old, and she did not mean it as a criticism. Around 9 that mild night, my phone rang again, and this time it was not a text. It was Doris, and she got straight to the point the way I imagine she does with every call she makes after a long day. She told me the letter I had heard read that afternoon was not the only page Cornelius had left behind. There was a second page sealed separately, addressed to me alone, one she had been instructed not to read aloud to anyone, including the rest of the family. I was very specific about the timing, she said. He wanted you to have it once the noise of the day had settled, not before. I asked her what the noise of the day had to do with a letter. She said she thought he meant exactly what he said, and that she would drop it by in the morning if that suited me. I did not sleep well that night, and I do not think it was only about the letter. I kept circling back to the sight of my ex-wife's hand, gripping that counter, and to the sound of her voice, with no edge left in it at all. A man can carry grief for a marriage that is already over in a dozen different ways, and I was still sorting out which one I was carrying that particular night. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and went back out to the garage. I just sat near the workbench without turning on the overhead light. I did not touch the sketch again. I just sat there in the dark a while, the way you sit near a thing that matters, without needing to hold it. Morning came in gray and quiet. The rain finally stopped, steam still rising faintly off the porch boards where the sun had not yet reached. I sat out there with a cup of coffee and my father's old canvas jacket over my shoulders, the one I still keep on a hook by my sister's back door. Doris arrived a little after 8 in slacks and a plain sweater, instead of yesterday's suit, and handed me a single sealed envelope without much ceremony. She said she would give me the porch to myself, and she meant it, walking back to her car to wait, rather than standing over my shoulder. I opened it slowly, the way you open something you suspect might rearrange a few rooms in you. Cornelius's handwriting filled 2 pages shakier than I remembered it from years back, but unmistakably his. He wrote that he had asked me once what I planned to build, once he no longer needed building for, and that he did not think I had ever really answered him. He wrote that he did not need me to answer it out loud because he had watched the answer for 2 years without me realizing I was giving it. He wrote that a man's worth isn't the noise he makes. It's the weight he holds up without anybody hearing it. Creak. He wrote that he had been watching me hold up more than anybody in that family understood. He wrote one more thing near the bottom of the second page that I read 4 times before I let myself believe it was really there. He said he hoped that whatever came of the patent, whatever the number turned out to be, I would let it be the last weight I ever had to carry alone. Sitting there on that porch, with 2 pages going soft between my fingers, I finally understood what I had not forgiven. It was not my ex-wife standing in that kitchen calling me pathetic to people who should have known better. It was the boy I used to be, the one who believed he had to be useful to somebody before he had earned the right to simply stay. I had built my whole adult life trying to answer a question nobody but a lonely child had ever actually asked me. I sat with that a long while before I moved again. Micah came out onto the porch a little after that, still in socked feet, and sat down on the top step without asking permission. He asked me in the plain way 16-year-olds ask the hardest questions without meaning to, whether I was going to be okay. I told him I thought so eventually, and he nodded, like that satisfied him more than a longer answer would have. Then he asked me something else. Something that caught me sideways. He wanted to know if I was ever going to build something just for myself, the way I had built that rail for his great-uncle. I did not have an answer ready for him, not a real one, and I told him that. He said that it was fine, that he could wait, and went back inside to find something to eat the way teenagers do when a conversation has run its natural course. My grandmother used to say, "A locked door doesn't care how politely you knock. It only opens for the right key." I finally understood which door she had meant. I sat on that porch until the coffee went cold a second time, and I did not mind it going cold. Doris waited by her car the whole while reading something on her own phone, giving me exactly the kind of space a person needs after a morning like that. When I finally stood up and walked over to thank her, she waved it off before I could finish the sentence, the way people do when they know the thanks belongs to someone who can no longer hear it. "I was a good man to work for," she said, and got in her car. And that was the last thing anybody said to me that whole strange week that I have not turned over in my mind at least 100 times since. I did not go back to that house on Delmar Lane for 3 weeks. When I finally did, it was only to return the 7-day pill organizer to a drawer where it could rest for good. My ex-wife answered the door herself. We did not resolve everything standing in that doorway, and I am not going to pretend to you that we did. That is not how real forgiveness moves. We talked for a while, on that same back porch, quieter than either of us had managed to be in years. We agreed on exactly one thing before I left. Neither of us had ever really been angry at the other person. We had both been exhausted by a version of ourselves neither of us had chosen on purpose. She told me near the end of that conversation that she had broken things off with her fiancé the week after the funeral. She did not offer many details, and I did not ask for them. Some doors close on their own once enough light gets into a room. That is not a happy ending, and I am not offering it to you as one. It is just the truer ending, the kind that does not need a ballroom or an audience to be worth something. If there is one thing I would want you to carry out of this story, it is this. Being useful to people is not the same thing as being loved by them. A man can spend a whole decade confusing the two before anybody, including himself, notices the difference. I do not regret the years I spent caring for Cornelius Vance, not 1 hour of them. I only regret how long it took me to understand that I was allowed to be cared for too. By somebody, and eventually by myself. I still have that graph paper sketch framed, now hanging in my sister's kitchen above the coffee maker, right where I can see it every morning. Cornelius Vance's name is written in small letters in the corner the way he insisted it be there, even though the patent itself never carried it. I built a second version of that rail since then, lighter and adjustable. I have started teaching 2 young men at my church how machines like it actually go together. Neither of them has any idea yet that the real lesson is not about aluminum or pivot points at all. Some debts get repaid in dollars, and the company that licensed that patent paid theirs in full. Some debts only ever get repaid in a framed piece of graph paper on a kitchen wall. I have come to believe that second kind is worth more. A few weeks after all of this, I finally went back to a family reunion. The first one I had made it to in 3 years. My grandmother's old sayings got repeated around those pecan trees the way they always do. Secondhand now passed through cousins who never met her, but somehow inherited her exact cadence. Somebody handed me a paper plate, and somebody else handed me a folding chair, and nobody asked me to prove I belonged there. I did not have to be useful to anyone that whole afternoon, and for the first time in longer than I could easily count, that felt like enough.